The date is November 15th, 1965. Landing Zone X-ray, Ia Drang Valley, Vietnam. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore stands in a foxhole at the edge of a contested perimeter. His battalion has been fighting for 36 hours. 79 of his men are dead. 121 are wounded. One entire platoon is cut off, surrounded by North Vietnamese army soldiers who are trying to overrun the isolated position. Moore's radio operator hands him the handset. The call is from division headquarters in An Khe, 40 miles away. The voice on the other end is calm, professional. The message is clear. General William Westmoreland's staff in Saigon needs a briefing on the ongoing battle. The situation at X-ray has become a matter of concern at the highest levels of command. The request is direct. Moore is ordered to board a helicopter at first light tomorrow morning, fly back to division headquarters, brief the commanding general and his staff on the tactical situation, then return to the battle. Moore looks around the perimeter. His soldiers are in shallow foxholes. Some are wounded and waiting for medevac helicopters that cannot land because of enemy fire. Others are firing at North Vietnamese soldiers who are close enough to throw grenades. The cut-off platoon is 400 meters away through enemy-controlled terrain. They have been surrounded for over 24 hours. Moore has been trying to reach them since the moment they were cut off. The division staff officer on the radio is waiting for confirmation. Moore keys the handset. He transmits his response in language that is professional but absolute. I respectfully decline. I will not leave this position until the battle is over and all my men are accounted for. There is a pause on the other end. The staff officer tries again. The order is repeated. The general needs the briefing. Moore is the battalion commander. He has the clearest picture of the tactical situation. His presence is required. Moore's response does not change. He will not leave. He will send his executive officer to brief headquarters if they need information. But he will not abandon his battalion while they are in contact with the enemy. The radio goes silent. The order is not repeated. Moore hands the handset back to his radio operator and continues directing the defense. This is not a story about a single refusal. It is a forensic examination of what happens when two competing philosophies of command collide at the moment of maximum crisis. It is the story of how the United States military in 1965 was fighting two different wars simultaneously. One war was being directed by generals in air-conditioned headquarters who viewed the battlefield through maps and statistics. The other war was being fought by soldiers in the mud who understood that leadership requires physical presence at the point of greatest danger, and it is the story of why Moore's refusal to leave his men shocked the institutional culture of the American military and forced a reckoning with what command actually means when soldiers are dying. To understand why Moore's refusal mattered, you need to understand what he was refusing, because the order to leave was not unusual. It was standard procedure. And that standard procedure was killing the institution. Part 1. The command culture that valued information over presence. Let's be precise about what the American military's command culture looked like in Vietnam in 1965. Because the problem was not incompetence. It was a philosophical assumption about how modern warfare should be conducted. An assumption that technology had changed the requirements of battlefield leadership. The assumption was this: a commander's primary value is his ability to process information and make decisions. His physical location is irrelevant as long as he has access to communications and intelligence. Therefore, the safest and most efficient place for a senior commander to position himself is in a helicopter or a headquarters where he can receive reports from multiple units simultaneously and coordinate their actions. This was not an unreasonable theory. The helicopter had changed the geometry of command. For the first time in military history, a battalion or brigade commander could be anywhere on the battlefield within minutes. He could observe multiple company-level fights from the air. He could talk to his subordinate commanders by radio. He could call in artillery and air support. He could make decisions based on a god's-eye view of the terrain that no ground-based commander could match. The problem was that this theory assumed that information transmitted by radio was equivalent to information gathered by physical presence. It assumed that a commander circling at 1,500 feet could understand what his soldiers on the ground were experiencing. It assumed that leadership was primarily an intellectual exercise rather than a physical and psychological contract. By 1965, the command and control helicopter had become standard practice. Battalion commanders routinely directed their companies from the air. Brigade commanders circled above their battalions. Some rarely set foot on the ground except to land at secure firebases for briefings. Moore had watched this culture develop, and he despised it. He had written about it in his personal notes. He had argued against it with his peers. His objection was not sentimental, it was tactical. A commander in a helicopter cannot judge the fatigue of his soldiers. He cannot see the micro-terrain that provides cover or concealment. He cannot hear the volume of fire or distinguish between harassing fire and a coordinated assault. He cannot smell the fear or see the resolve in his soldiers' eyes. He cannot assess whether his orders are achievable or suicidal because he is not standing in the place where those orders will be executed. More fundamentally, Moore understood that command in combat is not just about giving orders. It is about establishing the moral authority that makes soldiers willing to execute those orders when execution means probable death. And that authority cannot be transmitted by radio. It can only be earned by shared risk. Moore had made a promise to his battalion before they deployed to Vietnam. The promise was public. He stated it in formation in front of the entire unit. The promise was this: when we go into combat, I will be the first man on the ground and the last man out, and I will leave no man behind. This was not rhetoric. It was a binding contract. Moore was offering his soldiers a guarantee that he would share their risk, that he would not ask them to do anything he was not willing to do himself, that when the shooting started, he would be standing in the same danger they were standing in. The institutional culture that produced the order for Moore to leave X-Ray did not value that contract. The headquarters staff saw Moore as an information source, a tactical asset that needed to be preserved and efficiently utilized. The fact that Moore had promised his soldiers he would be the last man out was not relevant to the staff's calculus. What mattered was that the commanding general needed a briefing, and Moore had the information. This is where the two command philosophies diverged. The headquarters staff viewed Moore's battalion as a unit, a collection of soldiers executing a mission. Moore viewed his battalion as a group of individual men who had trusted him with their lives based on a promise he had made. The headquarters could replace Moore if he was killed, but his soldiers could not replace the trust they had placed in his promise. Part 2. The tactical reality of X-Ray. Here is what the situation at Landing Zone X-Ray looked like when the order to evacuate Moore arrived. The numbers are specific, the geometry is clear, the danger was absolute. Moore's battalion had inserted into X-Ray beginning at 10:30 a.m. on November 14th. The landing zone could accommodate 8 to 10 helicopters at a time. The battalion was being lifted in increments. Not all his soldiers were on the ground when the first contact occurred. At 12:15 p.m., less than 2 hours after the first helicopter landed, the battalion made contact with North Vietnamese forces. Not a patrol, not a small unit, an entire regiment. Over 2,000 North Vietnamese army soldiers who had been staging in the Chu Pong Massif directly adjacent to the landing zone. The fighting was immediate and close range. North Vietnamese soldiers were attacking from multiple directions. They were attempting to overrun the landing zone before Moore could get his entire battalion on the ground. The next several hours were a race. Moore was trying to get soldiers onto X-Ray faster than the North Vietnamese could kill them. By nightfall, on November 14th, Moore's entire battalion was on the ground, but the perimeter was under continuous pressure. North Vietnamese forces were probing for weak points. They were launching company-sized assaults against specific positions. They were attempting to isolate and destroy individual platoons. The most critical tactical problem was the cut-off platoon. Second Lieutenant Henry Herrick had led his platoon forward in pursuit of retreating North Vietnamese soldiers. The platoon had gotten separated from the main perimeter. North Vietnamese forces had moved around them and cut them off. Herrick was killed in the first minutes. The platoon was now commanded by a sergeant, 29 men surrounded by an estimated 200 to 300 North Vietnamese soldiers. Moore had been attempting to reach the cut-off platoon for over 24 hours. Every attempt had been repulsed. The terrain between the main perimeter and the cut-off position was controlled by the enemy. Any force moving through that terrain was taking casualties from multiple directions. The cut-off platoon was running out of ammunition. They were rationing every round. The wounded could not be evacuated. Dead soldiers were being used as cover because there was no time or safety to move them. The platoon was calling in artillery so close to their own position that the explosions were throwing dirt onto the men in the foxholes. This was the situation when division headquarters called and ordered Moore to leave. Think about what leaving would have meant. Moore would board a helicopter at first light, fly to division headquarters, spend several hours briefing the commanding general and his staff, then fly back. The earliest he could return would be mid-morning, possibly afternoon if the briefing ran long or if helicopter availability was limited. During those hours, the cut-off platoon would still be surrounded. The main perimeter would still be under attack. The soldiers would know their battalion commander had left. They would know he had boarded a helicopter and flown away while they were fighting for their lives. The psychological impact would have been catastrophic. Moore had promised them he would be the last man out. If he left before the battle was over, that promise was void. The contract was broken, and soldiers who believe their commander has abandoned them do not fight with the same resolve as soldiers who believe their commander will die before leaving them behind. Moore understood this. The staff officers at division headquarters either did not understand it or did not consider it relevant. Their priority was information flow. Moore's priority was mission accomplishment, and the mission could not be accomplished if the soldiers lost faith in their commander. Part 3. The institutional meaning of the refusal. Moore's refusal to obey the order to evacuate was not insubordination in the formal sense. He did not curse at the staff officer. He did not argue. He stated his position clearly and professionally. But he made it clear that he would not comply. This was a calculated risk. Moore was a lieutenant colonel. The order was coming from general officer level. In the military hierarchy, a lieutenant colonel does not refuse orders from generals. The consequences for doing so can include relief of command, court-martial, and the end of a career. Moore accepted that risk. He had decided that his obligation to his soldiers superseded his obligation to the chain of command. This decision reveals something fundamental about his command philosophy. He believed that leadership is ultimately about the soldiers in the foxholes, not the generals in the headquarters. There is a broader institutional context that makes this moment significant. The United States military in 1965 was struggling with a generational divide in command culture. The senior leadership, the generals who had fought in World War II and Korea, had developed their command philosophy in large-scale conventional wars where front lines were relatively stable and headquarters could be positioned behind secure perimeters. Vietnam was different. There were no front lines. There were no secure rear areas. The battlefield was 360 degrees. An enemy force could appear anywhere at any time. The command and control helicopter made sense in theory because it gave commanders mobility and communications. But it also created physical and psychological distance between commanders and soldiers. Junior officers, the captains and majors and lieutenant colonels who were actually leading men in combat, were increasingly skeptical of the command from the air philosophy. They saw the disconnection. They watched battalion and brigade commanders make decisions from helicopters that made sense on a map but were impossible to execute on the ground. They saw the cost in casualties when orders were based on incomplete understanding of the terrain and the enemy. Moore's refusal at X-Ray was not an isolated act of defiance. It was a public statement of which command philosophy he believed in. He was saying that physical presence matters, that shared risk matters, that a commander's obligation to his soldiers takes precedence over administrative convenience. The fact that headquarters did not repeat the order is significant. They could have relieved Moore of command. They could have sent another officer to take over the battalion and ordered Moore to report to division. They did not. The staff officer on the radio accepted Moore's refusal and moved on. This suggests that even within the institutional culture that valued information and efficiency, there was recognition that Moore's position had merit. That forcing a battalion commander to abandon his men in the middle of a desperate fight would damage morale and potentially compromise the mission. Part 4. What soldiers remember. The soldiers of 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, did not know about the order for Moore to evacuate. They did not hear the radio conversation. They did not know that headquarters had given Moore an opportunity to leave, and he had refused it. But they knew Moore was still there. They saw him moving through the perimeter, checking positions, talking to company commanders, calling in artillery, coordinating medevac helicopters. They knew he had been on the first helicopter into X-Ray. and they could see that he was still there 36 hours later while the fighting continued. The psychological impact of Moore's presence was documented by multiple soldiers in after-action interviews and memoirs. Joe Galloway, the journalist who was at X-Ray and later co-wrote the book We Were Soldiers Once and Young with Moore, stated it directly. Those of us who survived Landing Zone X-Ray survived because of his brilliance of command. I think every one of us thought we were going to die at that place except Hal Moore. He was certain we were going to win that fight, and he was right. This is the core of Moore's command philosophy. Soldiers fighting in a surrounded perimeter against overwhelming numbers need to believe that survival is possible. If they believe they are going to die, they will fight differently. Some will give up, others will panic. The unit cohesion that holds a perimeter together will fracture. Moore's presence created belief. Not because he lied to his soldiers, not because he minimized the danger, because he was standing in the same danger they were standing in, and he was projecting confidence that they would win. His physical presence was proof that he believed what he was saying. If he believed the situation was hopeless, he would have accepted the opportunity to evacuate. The fact that he stayed meant he believed they could hold. This is not quantifiable in after-action reports. There is no metric for measuring the impact of a commander's presence on soldier morale. But every combat veteran knows it matters. Soldiers fight harder for commanders they trust, and trust is built through shared risk. The cutoff platoon was reached on November 16th. Moore led the relief force personally. When they broke through to the isolated soldiers, 9 were dead, 13 were wounded. The survivors had been surrounded for over 30 hours. They had run out of food and were almost out of ammunition. They had survived by calling artillery fire within meters of their position and fighting off multiple assaults. When Moore reached them, the first thing the platoon sergeant said was that they knew someone would come for them. They knew Moore would not leave them behind. This belief kept them fighting when surrender might have seemed rational. Part 5. The institutional legacy. Moore's refusal to leave X-Ray did not change the institutional culture overnight. Command and control helicopters continued to be standard practice throughout the Vietnam War. Many battalion and brigade commanders continued to direct operations from the air, but Moore's example created an alternative model. It demonstrated that boots-on-the-ground leadership could work, that a commander could be physically present at the point of greatest danger and still maintain effective command and control. That shared risk enhanced rather than diminished command authority. The long-term impact appears in the doctrine and training that developed after Vietnam. The United States military eventually codified the concept of mission command, which emphasized decentralized execution and commander's intent over detailed control. Part of that doctrine includes the expectation that commanders will position themselves where they can best influence the fight, which often means forward rather than in a headquarters. The expectation that senior commanders will share risk with their soldiers became more explicit. It is now considered a professional failing for a commander to direct operations from a safe location while asking subordinates to accept danger. This is a direct legacy of the example Moore and others like him set in Vietnam. There is also a more subtle institutional impact. Moore's refusal demonstrated that there are times when a commander's obligation to his soldiers supersedes his obligation to obey orders from higher headquarters. This is a dangerous principle to institutionalize because it can lead to chaos if applied carelessly. But it is also necessary because headquarters do not always understand the tactical reality on the ground. The military culture now recognizes that junior commanders have the right and the obligation to push back against orders that will get their soldiers killed for no tactical gain. This is formalized in the concept of mission-type orders and the expectation that subordinate commanders will use their judgment to interpret and execute orders based on the actual situation rather than blindly following instructions that may be based on incomplete information. Moore did not create this culture by himself, but his example at X-Ray became part of the institutional memory. The story was told and retold. It appeared in leadership courses. It was cited in professional journals. It became a reference point for discussions about what effective command looks like in combat. Part 6. The verdict. The order for Moore to evacuate X-Ray was not malicious. The staff officers who sent it were not trying to harm the battalion. They were operating within a command culture that valued information and efficiency. They needed a briefing from the battalion commander. Moore had the information. Therefore, Moore should report to headquarters and provide the briefing. The flaw in this logic was that it treated Moore as an interchangeable component. It assumed that his value was purely informational, that his executive officer could command the battalion while Moore briefed headquarters, that the soldiers would not notice or care that their commander had left in the middle of the fight. Moore understood that this assumption was wrong. He understood that his value as a commander was not just his tactical knowledge, it was his presence, his physical embodiment of the promise he had made to be first in and last out, his willingness to stand in the same danger his soldiers were standing in. When he refused to leave, he was making a statement about what leadership means. He was saying that a commander's primary obligation is to the soldiers executing the mission, not to the headquarters requesting information. He was saying that shared risk is not optional. It is the foundation of command authority. The soldiers who fought at X-Ray remembered that Moore stayed. They did not know about the order to evacuate, but they knew that when they looked around the perimeter in the middle of the fight, Moore was there. And that knowledge gave them the resolve to keep fighting when the situation seemed hopeless. This is what systems look like when two command philosophies collide. One system values efficiency and information flow. The other values presence and shared risk. One system treats commanders as managers directing operations from a distance. The other treats commanders as leaders who earn authority by standing in the danger they are asking others to face. Moore proved that the second system works. His battalion held X-Ray. They defeated a numerically superior enemy force. They rescued the cut-off platoon. They accomplished the mission. And they did it because their commander was standing with them in the foxholes rather than circling above them in a helicopter. The institutional culture that sent the evacuation order eventually had to confront this reality. Commanders who shared risk with their soldiers produced better results than commanders who directed from a distance. Units with commanders who kept their promises had better morale and cohesion than units with commanders who prioritized administrative convenience. The verdict is this: Moore's refusal to abandon his men was not just an act of personal courage, it was a rejection of a command philosophy that had lost sight of what leadership actually requires. The headquarters staff saw a battalion commander as an information source that needed to be debriefed. Moore saw himself as a contract enforcer who had promised his soldiers he would be last out and intended to keep that promise regardless of what headquarters wanted. That difference mattered. The soldiers who fought at X-Ray knew their commander would not leave them. That knowledge made them willing to hold the perimeter when every tactical indicator suggested they should retreat. The cut-off platoon knew someone would come for them because Moore had promised no man would be left behind. That belief kept them fighting when surrender was the logical choice. Command is not management. Leadership is not administration. Authority is not derived from rank. It is earned through shared risk and kept promises. Moore understood this in a way that the institutional culture of his era did not. And when he was given the choice between administrative compliance and mission accomplishment, he chose the mission and the men executing it. The order to evacuate was repeated 0 times after Moore refused. The staff officers moved on. Moore stayed in the foxhole. The battalion held the perimeter. And the institutional culture learned, slowly and reluctantly, that the commander in the mud with his soldiers was more valuable than the commander in the helicopter with the radio. If your father or grandfather served with Hal Moore at Ia Drang or anywhere else, I want to hear about it in the comments. What did he tell you about Moore's leadership? What stories did he share about those days at X-Ray? The official histories record the casualties and the tactical outcome. The comments record what it felt like to fight under a commander who kept his promises. Those details matter more than any after-action report. Write them down, they deserve to be preserved.